while for it to tape what I'm saying, and then it tapes the screen, and if I write anything on there, it tapes that too. So, yeah. So, anyway, let's go ahead and get started. We are going to talk about the War of 1812. We're going to do it all in one day. So, I mean, you may kind of feel like you've been, like, abused today, but that's just the way it's going to be. We've got to move it. And we're going to talk about what caused it, the major events, and then the effects or the impacts of the war. Now, before we get started, let's do a quick recap of where we've been and what we've done. We've done 3 presidents up to this point. Obviously, who was the first one? George Washington. Who's number 2? John Adams. Who's number 3? Thomas Jefferson. Now, what were some major events in Jefferson? You did performances on it. Come on. Okay, Louisiana Purchase. What else? Lewis and Clark. Embargo Act, and then we talked about his inauguration and all stuff like that. Okay, so here's what I want you to know to kind of set the foundation. Jefferson leaves office, okay, and it's because of the Embargo Act, because it's so bad, and we'll briefly talk about that for a moment. James Madison becomes president number 4. James Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State, and what you need to start catching on to is that the Secretary of State position on the cabinet becomes kind of the stepping stone to the presidency. So what you'll see over time is that if you're Secretary of State, you usually eventually become President of the United States. And that kind of happens for a while. So Madison is president. Britain and France are still at war. Napoleon is still fighting Britain, so don't forget about that. Britain is still being a butthole to us. France is still being a butthole to us, and we're having to deal with that. There is going to be conflict with Indians, okay? And then we're going to get to see some burning down of the Capitol. We're going to have a crazy Indian who's mentally ill, who thinks that he can see into the future, who puts a curse on the presidency. We'll talk about that. So we got all kinds of crazy crap happen today. All right? So I'm going to go ahead and get us going. And looks like we're recording okay. And you need to take notes, obviously. And you're not going to be able to write down everything that's on the slide. So you need to shorten, you need to paraphrase. If you see something that is cap and underline or bold and underline, that means you most definitely need to get it down. Okay? And we're just going to have a normal test over this unit, and that will be next week. And we are covering like 12 presidents in one unit. So brace yourself. It's going to be a marathon. Okay? All right. Jefferson realizes that the Embargo Act stinks. And just to refresh your memory, the Embargo Act says that we can't trade with anyone but fellow Americans. So that means that our only money-making opportunity is to sell to each other. You can see how that's a disaster, right? Our money-making opportunities go way down, and it hurts our economy. So he says, you know what? My political career is over because of this. Now, what he does do is right before he leaves office, and those of you who did the Embargo Act, you usually mention this, he passes a law called the Non-Intercourse Act. And what it says is, okay, we can now trade with everybody in the world except we can't trade with Britain and we can't trade with France. So he does make that little change before he leaves office. And then James Madison is elected as our next president in 1808. And this is a picture of his mug here. Okay. Now we're going to talk about Indians. And we're going to talk about one that, in my opinion, is a little off his rocker. We got 2 Indians. Tecumseh, bless you. Tecumseh, a strange name. Say Tecumseh, everybody. That was pretty awesome. Okay, Tecumseh is a Shawnee Indian. Now, he also has a brother. His brother's real name is Tenskwatawa. Say that 3 times really fast. Okay, good luck. Yeah, Tenskwatawa. I can't do it. Okay, now, Tenskwatawa's nickname is the Prophet. Tenskwatawa believes he can see into the future. And this is how he believes he can see into the future. This is his process. He builds a fire, bless you, and waits for it to smoke. And when it smokes, he puts his face into the smoke and claims that when he puts his face into the smoke, it makes him cry and forces him into this ability to see into the future. He's a whack job, okay? But because of that, his nickname is the Prophet. Now, Tecumseh and his brother the Prophet get together and say, you know what? We want to stick it to the white man because they keep on taking our stuff. How are we going to do that? There are more of them than us. So Tecumseh says, why don't we just join all of us together? Strength in numbers. Makes sense, right? And so he reaches out to all Indian tribes in the United States and says, let's come together. Let's form our own nation and let's beat these suckers into the ground and make them pay. And most Indian tribes say, you know what? We're in. So Tecumseh forms a confederation, okay, of Indian tribes, and they create their own capital city. Their capital city ends up being in what is today Indiana, and they name the capital city Prophetstown after Tecumseh's brother, because Tecumseh's brother is like the charismatic cult leader. You know, he stands up in front of people and sticks his face in smoke, and then all of a sudden tears and says, we will, do X, Y, and Z. And people are like, oh, the Prophet, you're awesome, right? So he brings people in. People love this guy. Why, I don't know, but they do. So Prophetstown's named after him. That's where their capital city is. Tribal leaders come in and meet there. They develop a plan. Now, obviously, the United States government sees this happening and says, not on our territory, you're not. We're going to clean your clock. We're going to get rid of you. And so, hence, there's a battle at Prophetstown between the U.S. and Tecumseh's Confederation. Okay? And it's called the Battle of, and I'm not making this up, Tippecanoe, because Prophetstown is located on Tippecanoe Creek in what is today Indiana. Okay? Tippecanoe. Literally, not making it up. These are pictures of the two gentlemen. Artist depiction of Tecumseh, because we don't have the camera until 1839, and this is 1811. So all we can rely on are artist depictions. So supposedly this is what Tecumseh looked like, and this is what his brother, the Prophet, or Tenskwatawa, looked like. Strange. Okay, and here's Indiana, and if you're wondering roughly where is this Tippecanoe battle, Prophetstown, roughly about right there, where you see that white arrow, where we're talking about in terms of space and time. Okay, so you'll see all caps underlined, bold. That means this is important, and you need to be sure you get it. The Battle of Tippecanoe happens in 1811. The U.S. versus Tecumseh's Confederation. The man leading the U.S. military in this battle, his name is William Henry Harrison. He attacks Prophetstown, and he wins. The Indians lose. Why is this important? Well, number one, it just says to white people, just keep on taking their stuff, because we can beat them. No reason to be scared of these people. Just keep on mowing them down. That's not good for the natives, obviously. It's a huge, huge boost to William Henry Harrison because he becomes a superstar. He is known throughout the United States as being the Indian killer, right? Which makes him a very celebrated man, oddly enough, and helps him to become president of the United States eventually on down the line in 1840. And his campaign slogan is Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So his nickname becomes Tippecanoe because he won the battle. Okay? Now, in the battle, Tecumseh dies. The Prophet survives. So the fortune teller, smoke, crier, whatever, he survives the whole thing. Now here's what's odd. He puts a curse, supposedly, on the U.S. presidency. He's angry, understandably. And he says, I'm going to predict that William Henry Harrison will become the great chief, and when he becomes the great chief, meaning President of the United States, he will die while he's in office. And then every 20 years thereafter, the great chief of the United States will die while in office. Right? And he says this at the end of the battle in front of U.S. troops, and the U.S. troops are like, whatever. Right? So you can probably already see the writing on the wall here, how this goes. Okay, another map. We'll skip that. I think we got it. One of the U.S. soldiers who overheard this actually wrote down in his journal what the prophet said, supposedly, and so the prophet's words are in yellow. The U.S. soldier's words are in white. You don't need to write all this down, but it just shows, the prophet says, Harrison will not win this year to be the great chief, but he may win next year. If he does, he will not finish his term. He will die in his office. And, of course, the U.S. soldier says, well, no president has ever died up to this point, right? And the prophet says, but Harrison will die. I tell you, and when he dies, you will remember my brother Tecumseh's death. You think that I have lost my powers, I who caused the sun to darken and red men to give up firewater. But I tell you, Harrison will die, and after him, every great chief chosen every 20 years thereafter will die. And when each one dies, let everyone remember the death of our people. Right? And supposedly, according to eyewitness accounts, the U.S. soldiers literally laughed in his face. They were making fun of him, saying, yeah, where'd you get this from? Did you see it in the smoke from the fire? You big dork, right? And he just walks away. Well, now, there's a lot more to it than this. I mean, there are people who've disputed this, but here are some of the basic facts. In 1840, William Henry Harrison is elected president. He goes out in the rain and gives his inaugural speech. And people say to him, don't go out in the rain, you'll get sick, right? And William Henry Harrison says, I'm president, I'm stepping out in the rain, and I'm giving my speech. He gives the longest inaugural speech on record. It's 2 hours long, roughly. Comes back in, gets sick, catches pneumonia, and a week after he gives his inaugural speech, drops dead. 20 years later, Abraham Lincoln is elected. And while he is in office, he is assassinated and dies. 20 years later, in 1880, Garfield is elected our president and is assassinated and dies. 20 years later, in 1900, McKinley is assassinated, dies. Seeing the trend here? 1920, Harding dies of natural causes, kind of like Harrison. 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies of natural causes. 1960, John F. Kennedy is assassinated and dies. And it's not until like the 80s that it kind of starts to fall apart. 1980, Reagan is shot, but he survives. And we haven't had anything happen since. So, I don't know. Maybe. Some people think Reagan broke the curse. Does the curse really exist? I don't know. But the William Henry Harrison situation is most definitely creepy. Yeah, because, he just goes out and stands in the rain and gives a speech. Admittedly, it's a long one, right? And admittedly, medicine is not as advanced as it is today, right? But, he gets pneumonia after standing out in the rain, and that's the end of him. Gone. Poof. After a week. So, just think about that for a little bit. See what you think about it. Okay, now we're back to Britain and France. You get sick of talking about them, and so do I. Okay? But I will tell you, after the War of 1812, there's not much to say about them after that. Okay. Britain is irritated with us because of the Non-Intercourse Act that says that we cannot trade with them. So here's what they decide to do to try to force us to trade with them. They go up to Indians and Native Americans in the United States that preside there and say, hey, have you ever heard of a thing called gunpowder? Right? Because Native Americans at this time are still fighting with bow and arrow. Okay? And the Native Americans are like, I don't know, what are you talking about? And they show them. They break out, a musket and say, watch this. Blammo! And the Native Americans are like, oh, mama! Right? Give us a little bit of that. And so the British say, hey, we will give you gunpowder and we will give you muskets and pistols and things like that if you'll go kill Americans for us. Go kill us some Americans. We'll provide you with weapons. We'll also give you liquor, whiskey, rum, right? If you do this for us. So, they essentially sick the Indians on us. They also ramp up taking our ships. I mean, they've been doing it, but it just gets worse. They continue to impress our soldiers, and they do it more so. And so James Madison, early on in his presidency, is left to try to figure out, how am I going to get this to stop? So that's one issue that we've got going on. So we'll let you get that down a minute. Okay, so Madison's great idea is, how are we going to get this to stop? So what Madison does is he sends ambassadors to Britain and France, and each of those ambassadors say, hey, whoever stops messing with us first, we will start trading with you again, but we won't trade with the other one. So let's say Britain stops first. Then we'll trade with Britain but not trade with France. Well, you can see what happens. France stops seizing our ships first. France backs off and says, we'll stop bothering you and messing with you. Right? And so what we say is, okay, fine, we will do business with you, but we will not do business with the British. Well, it's not really a great idea, because it just makes our tensions with Britain even greater than they already were, right? Because Britain's like, wait a second, you're going to trade with them, but you're not going to trade with us? Stick it! So what Britain does is just gives more weapons to the Indians and takes more of our ships and more of our soldiers than they were already doing. So it just ramps up the tension. Then it also ramps up tension among Americans. War hawks. You got to know this. War hawks, that is a term used even still today. If you're somebody who supports going to war, you're a war hawk. And there are a lot of war hawks at this time who say, are we going to let Britain continue to push us around? We can't let this happen. So they demand war, and then Britain makes it worse. Britain blockades our ports so that we can't trade with France. And when I say blockades our ports, they take ships and blockade the entire eastern coastline of the United States from Maine to Georgia. And then they blockade New Orleans. So, I mean, nothing's getting in and nothing's getting out. And that was literally the straw that broke the camel's back. That's where Madison says, all right, that's it. I got no choice. Right? Because they are cutting us off economically. They are cutting us off to food supplies. We can't get anything we need. Sullivan, what's your question? Yeah, we eventually find out. So it's not done in total secrecy. Okay? And they kind of want us to know. So they don't try to really cover it up. Because at this point, they just don't really care. They really want us to go to war with them. Because remember, we beat them in the American Revolution, but France had to help us do it. And they're the best military in the world, and we defeated them, and we're the worst. So they got egg on their face. So do they need to save face? Yes. So they want to go to war with us again because they think that we can't beat them on our own. So they really think that this war that is eventually going to happen is a most definite 100% victory for them. They are not worried about it in the least. And they're just waiting for it to happen. Now, I mean, you know what happens because we're still the United States of America. You know we win, right? But if this war had gone differently, we wouldn't be. We'd be probably having crumpets and tea at 3 p.m. today. Okay? But we're not because we won the dang thing. Okay. So, June 1812, you need to be sure you get down. June 1812, Madison declares war and the War of 1812 begins. The other thing that you need to be sure that you get down is that it is also known as the Second War for Independence. Because we do. We have to essentially fight for our independence twice. Because this is Britain saying, sure, you beat us the first time. Now let's see what you can do with no help. So it's literally like, I don't know, two dumb boys fighting, and trying to even the score where maybe like in the first fight, one of them had help from friends, right? And they've been talking back and forth. There you go. Exactly. And they've been talking back and forth and saying, oh, yeah, but you can't do it by yourself, can you? Right? And it's like, well, yeah, I can. Right? And now it's about to happen. Yes. Britain has the Indians on their side, right? France, we've irritated, so France isn't going to help us this time. So and Britain knows all this, so they really think there's no way they can do it by themselves. And you'll see why they think it. I'm about to show you that next. There's a reason. Before we do that, important people become famous because of this war. James Madison, his wife Dolly, Andrew Jackson. We'll talk about him here in a minute. Francis Scott Key. Thurman can tell you all about him. What did he do? Right, and we'll talk about why that is. Okay? So, keep on going. Okay. Now, here's what's going on. Here's why Britain doesn't have a lot of worries right off the bat. Number one, they've got bigger fish to fry. I mean, they want to be at war with us eventually. But they are still fighting France. Yes, in 1812 it's still happening. They are fighting this guy. Class, who is this guy? Napoleon! Okay, the leader of France. So, Britain's thinking is this. This guy, scary. A threat. America, who's just declared war on us, I don't really care that much. Right? So, who are you going to try to knock out first, probably? You're going to try to get rid of him, because he's the real concern. So, Britain literally decides he's got to go first. Then we'll worry about the United States of America and their declaration of war upon us. Now, how does that help us? We get to hopefully try to be better prepared than we are. Yes. And I'm about to show you how unprepared we were. And we need, this is what you would call a reprieve, a break. We get a break because of Napoleon. So Napoleon is actually kind of our saving grace. Thank goodness. So this war is declared in 1812, but fighting doesn't really start until 1814. So we get about 2 years to just kind of sit back and kind of get our thoughts collected, our strategies developed, and get it going. Okay. So here's why we need the break or the reprieve. We have 16 ships in our Navy at the beginning of the War of 1812. The British, I can't give you an exact number, but they are in the hundreds. Yeah, they blockaded the entire eastern shoreline, so that should give you a good idea. Okay? And be aware, since George Washington, we have taken an approach of neutrality with everything. Okay? So we have no reason to build up a military. We haven't had one. So we haven't trained soldiers. We haven't collected supplies and resources. So we're short on ammunition. We're short on weaponry. We're short on everything. Essentially, we are in the same condition that we were in the Revolutionary War. We have not advanced. We have not improved. And since Britain has been taking our ships, we actually had more ships to begin with, but they've taken them. So we've been depleted. So we've got 2 years to try to build some more ships, 2 years to train, 2 years to build up ammunition, weaponry. And to do that, our government essentially loaned money, or borrowed money, I should say, from itself, right? Which then obviously hurts us on down the line, which we'll talk about later on. But we just borrowed and borrowed and borrowed and borrowed to try to build things up. Okay. All right, come on in. In 1814, Britain defeats Napoleon. And so that is the beginning, truly, of the War of 1812. So quickly get that down. 1814, Britain defeats Napoleon, and then it's on like Donkey Kong. I can after this. Okay? Thank you for checking. All right, so this is a map of battles of the War of 1812, and I know you're looking at it right now and you're like, what the crap, because it's crazy. We are only going to talk about 3 battles. There are 3 major battles that you need to know about. First one, we're going to talk about Washington, D.C. Didn't mean to do that. Come on. There we go. Washington, D.C., Fort McHenry, which is in Maryland, located at Baltimore, and then we're going to talk about the Battle of New Orleans, and that's what we're going to focus on with the War of 1812. And just briefly, Washington, D.C., we lose that battle. The British go in, they burn stuff down. We'll talk about that specifically. Fort McHenry is where we get the Star-Spangled Banner. We win that battle. And then the Battle of New Orleans involves Andrew Jackson going into the bars of New Orleans and rounding up pirates and slaves and Indians and criminals and saying, help me defeat the British. And he wins. And he's horribly outnumbered. So it's a bizarre battle that I always like to discuss because I just imagine how that must have gone and how that must have appeared. Huh? Well, it is pretty smart because he goes in and he gets French pirates. Have you ever heard of Jean Lafitte? He was a really famous French pirate, and he knows, Britain and France, they don't like each other. So he befriends Jean Lafitte, who was in New Orleans at the time, just hanging out, drinking, essentially, and says, hey, getting ready to fight the British here. Why don't you help me? And Jean Lafitte's like, I'll help you defeat the British any day because I hate those guys. All right? So, very, very good thinking. So let's keep on going. And there we go. Okay, so first we're going to look at Washington, D.C. Now, for the British, this is a very smart move because attacking the capital of any nation is effective, especially if you can really, really, really leave a severe mark. And they do. August 1814, the British take Washington, D.C., they take control of it, and they burn the White House, they set the Capitol on fire, they set the Treasury Department on fire, and a couple of other buildings that aren't as important, but still, they set the city on fire. Now, class, speak freely. Why do you want to attack a capital city if you can? Right, it's like chopping the head off a snake, right? You do that, and it's over, right? It's like taking the nucleus out. It's the central hub of everything. It also deals a psychological blow, right? That you've been able to go in and hit the nucleus or the central hub and destroy it. So that's their first visit. And I will tell you, after the British do this, they're thinking, we got it all under control. And once again, arrogance is their downfall. Washington, D.C. is successful. It works for them. And as a result, the British actually send troops back to Britain and leave a smaller force here to finish the war off. And that is a big mistake. Okay? Because now they have fewer forces on the ground. And those forces think it's over. I mean, they're literally thinking, well, we've sent troops back, so this is pretty much a war that has ended, and the United States is now going to be under British control, and we got nothing to worry about, which means those soldiers don't fight as hard. And as a result, we are successful in the rest of the war. So, the other thing I want you to know, Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, she's responsible for going through the White House while it's burning, and cinders are dropping and all this stuff like that, and she gathers up famous artifacts. Like, she gets the most famous portrait of George Washington, has one of her servants literally take a knife and cut it out of the frame. They roll it up. They run out the door with it. James Madison is the only U.S. president to ever be caught in the line of fire. He's running out the White House, and the British are firing on him, and they dump him in a carriage and get him the heck out of Dodge. So, I mean, he's almost on the verge of being kidnapped. I mean, you can see why the British are like, psh, this is over. We're done. This is good. We almost got the president. We almost killed him. We've burned stuff down. We've torn up Jack. Success. So, this is an artist depiction many, many years after of what happened at Washington, D.C. and the burning. Not a great picture, but at least kind of gives you a visual. This is a picture of Dolly Madison. Keep on going. This is an artist depiction of the White House after the fire, after it's been put out. And you'll see kind of that central domed section is gone. You got some destruction here. You got some smoke destruction right there at those windows. But, I mean, it's not. They don't burn it to the ground. But still. Okay, so we've talked Washington, D.C. Now we're going to talk about Fort McHenry. And Baltimore is not far away from Washington, D.C., as you can see. Baltimore, Maryland. And this is a picture of Fort McHenry and what it looks like today. But you'll see it's kind of in a pentagon shape. It's got the flag flying over it. Okay? This is a bombardment that happens for 2 days. Okay? And essentially what happens is the British just turn around and just give up. I mean, they could have kept on going and potentially taken Fort McHenry, but they just literally decide, we just took Washington, D.C. Why are we worried about this? This has been a whole lot of trouble. And they just turn around and go back out into the ocean with their ships. Always, I don't understand. But based on records and things, admirals and things wrote in the records that they just felt like it was not a necessary fort to take. And that they just decided to let it go because Washington, D.C. had been such a success. Now, it is also what gives us the Star-Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key is an American, and he's a lawyer. And one of his clients is a U.S. sailor who's on one of the ships out in the harbor that is in charge of protecting Fort McHenry. So the battle hasn't happened yet. I mean, Francis is just going in for a business call to meet with his client who has some kind of legal issue, right? And he finds out that his client is on his ship, right, on his boat where he serves, and so he just goes to the ship and boards the ship and says, I'm here to see, John Doe or whatever his name is. And they say, well, come on board, and, he's down below, and meet with him. So in the process of meeting with this guy, all of a sudden the British start bombing Fort McHenry while Francis Scott Key is on the ship. And he's a civilian, right? And so Francis Scott Key is like, you know what? I'm out of here. I don't want to be a part of this situation. This is going to get ugly. And they say, no, you can't leave the ship. You got to stay. It's not going to be safe for you. So just stay on the ship, wait until the bombardment's over, and then we'll let you go. Well, Francis Scott Key is thinking, what happens if the British win? Then I'm a prisoner of war, and I don't want that, right? But they make him stay. So the song is him looking through the porthole, right, in the hold, and he watches the entire bombardment. And he's got nothing else to do. So he sits down and writes what he sees, which then becomes the Star-Spangled Banner. And if you look at the lyrics, you'll see, oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? It's the flag of the United States that determines his fate. If that flag goes and becomes a British flag, it's over for him, right? He could have his head chopped off. So he's keying on the flag. And so he is so happy in the morning when it's all over to see that that flag is still there, because that American flag means he's safe and he's free and nobody's going to hurt him and he can get off the gosh dang boat. He also, I love, he talks about, rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. The only way he could see it through the night was by the actual bombardment occurring. And whenever, things would go off in the air, he could still see the flag there. So that's what the song is about. It doesn't become our national anthem until the early 1900s, but it's written and is played by the U.S. Navy. The minute he writes it, it is adopted by them and they play it all the time. But no national anthem until early 1900s. Okay, and that's the actual paper that he wrote on. Those are his words right there, his handwriting. That's in the Smithsonian. Okay, so we're at the end of the war, but we got one more battle to talk about. But here's what's weird. The war ends in 1814 with the Treaty of Ghent. The H is silent. Yet we have a battle happen after the treaty is signed. Why do you think that is? Closer. Not bad communication. What kind of communication do they have? Slow. Why? Right, and look where the treaty is signed. Where is it signed? Belgium, which is in Europe. So you've got British troops and American troops fighting in the United States. That's where the war takes place. The treaty is signed, as they say, across the pond or across the Atlantic in Europe in 1814. For the news to get to the United States, it has to get on a ship in the form of a letter or an article and ride that ship for about 3 months. And then the news gets to America that the war is over. Okay? So, Treaty of Ghent is signed. And then we have a battle. The other thing you need to know about the Treaty of Ghent is that Britain loses. And usually the loser has to do what in a treaty class? Pay money, pay reparations, or give what? Yes, Bristow. You got that going on. Well done. They give us nothing. Yet they lose. So a lot of Americans are like, what the crap? We just fought a second war for independence and they don't have to give us anything? They just said, we will go back to pre-war conditions. So, we don't get any money. We don't get any territory. Now, what we do get is most definitely our independence. So don't sit there and think that we got nothing. Because what happens after the War of 1812 is Britain leaves us alone completely, 100%. The world views us as an actual world power. Yes. Yes, exactly. So they even owe us money. Very good thinking. Yes. Yes. But, I mean, they do leave us alone after this. Honestly, it's over. Okay? So that is the plus. So let's look at, we can get it to go, the Battle of New Orleans, which actually has been, maybe unfortunately in your eyes, immortalized in song. We'll see if you've heard of this. Okay, so Andrew Jackson leads the Americans at the Battle of New Orleans. This is a song written by Jimmy Driftwood in like the 1950s or something. And why he chooses to write about the Battle of New Orleans, I'm not really sure. But he's actually from Arkansas, old Jimmy. And yeah, and I'm sure you love the song. And we're not going to listen to the whole song, but you'll see in part of the song they talk about Jean Lafitte, talk about the pirate, and all that stuff like that. But, you know, a lot of people know about the Battle of New Orleans because of this song. They don't really know what war it's involved in, but most people know about it because of Jimmy Driftwood and his song. Okay, so we're going to go back and go ahead and keep on moving forward because we're not going to listen to that whole thing. Okay, Battle of New Orleans, I've already kind of given you some information on it. It is very important because it happens after the war is over, which shows an indication of communication issues, and it makes Andrew Jackson a war hero. He is, I mean, a rock star because of what happens here. Okay? He has about 2 weeks to prepare for the battle. So, I mean, pretty much the British have made it known we're going to take New Orleans. And we plan on taking New Orleans in about 2 weeks. And so Andrew Jackson is ordered to prepare for the attack and to prepare defenses and to prepare his men. Now, he doesn't have really very many men to fight with, so that's why he goes into the bars of New Orleans where he spent a lot of his time and says, I need your help, guys. So, I mean, he's got alcoholics, Indian slaves, he's got pirates, he's got criminals. I mean, he's got everybody under the sun that he can round up to help him fight this battle. What they do is they go down into the swamps and they build essentially mud barriers, right, that they build up with mud, and they put bales of cotton on top of them, and that is their defense and protection between them and the British when the British come in and get off their boats. And so Jackson says, you're going to wait until they get right up on these barriers, and then we are all going to fire at once because we're outnumbered. And he said, and the only way that we're going to be able to take these guys down is to concentrate our firepower and wait until the very last minute. Well, it ends up being very effective because they slaughter a whole bunch of them all at once, obviously, and the British get scared. And luckily for them, the British that do survive retreat and say, we want nothing of this, right? And a lot of people believe that one of the things that scared the British were the Indians, because Jackson told the Indians, I want you to make as much noise as you can possibly make, right? When we start firing, I want you to start going like that, right? Make all your crazy little warrior noises. And the Indians are like, yeah, we'll do that. Interestingly enough, Andrew Jackson is the one who signs the Trail of Tears into effect, right? So he gets all this help from Indians, and then he signs off to ship their butts to Oklahoma. But anyway, you'll see, 2,000 British die, we lose 7 Americans, and of course we're using the term Americans very loosely, right? Because some of them are French, and some of them are slaves that we don't consider to be human beings at the time. And this happens 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent is signed. So it's a battle that's not needed. Doesn't need to happen, but nobody knows about the battle or the war, being over yet. And Andrew Jackson becomes a hero. Okay? All right. This is very important. I like to make this an essay on the test. So, questions. Martin. Okay, now there are some Indians that do. And that's a really good question. There are some Indian tribes that are very bothered by the Battle of Tippecanoe. And then there are some Indians that don't care. And here's why. Because Andrew Jackson would give them things like alcohol, guns. So he was doing essentially what the British did to kind of almost like bribe them or snag them in. So it's a really good question. Thurman. Well, it can be a very compelling thing to draw you into, certain activities for sure. And if you know anything about Native Americans, they are more likely to become addicted to alcohol. It's a genetic issue with them, and that's just the way it is. Now they didn't know that at the time. We know it now, right? But people figured out very quickly. Man, they like that stuff. It works. Now it's horrible. I mean, it's terrible. And we're guilty of doing some really, really awful things to certain groups of people. And with the Native Americans, that was our tactic: giving them guns and giving them like rum and whiskey and stuff like that. And that goes all the way back to the Spanish. They did that with them. So, all right. So, what do we get from the War of 1812? Well, we get nothing in terms of land or money. We get respect. That's the biggest thing. We get respect. We get pride because we did it ourselves. So Americans kind of step back and say, And then to me this is interesting. It may not be to you. This term right here finally becomes a part of our vocabulary. We had never, prior to the War of 1812, called ourselves Americans, right? And after War of 1812, we view ourselves as a unified, as an actual independent nation, and this term actually comes into being. And we start moving west. And westward expansion happens. We build roads, we build railroads, all that stuff. So that's kind of what we're embarking upon. Put this up, El Loco Queso.